Hi everybody, Johnny here. Hope you're doing great today. You can find more good math at jmathpage.com. Today we're looking at multiplying 8's, but we're going to do it in a special way. We're going to be thinking about multiplying 8's using the area model. So what does that mean? Let's try one out, okay? So what if I said to you 1 times 8? I want you to think about that for a moment. In the area model, we would think about it a little differently. We would think 1 times 8 is the same as 1 by 8. So we would say 1 by 8. What does that mean? 1 by 8 means we need to construct a rectangle that's 1 by 8 units long. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see. I'll start here. Here's a unit of 1. Now I need to make a measurement of 8 out this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I have 8 across the top. So this is 1 by 8. Well, how does that help us? Well, if we're using the area model, we can think about this in terms of a rectangle. Let's go ahead and make a rectangle. This side will be 1, and now we're going to measure out 8 this way. And we'll measure out 1 here, and we'll measure out 8 this way. Now we have a rectangle. Now in an area model, I want to know how many squares are in the inside. So let's go ahead and find out. Let's mark them off and count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 altogether. In an area model, what we care about is the area that's taken up by the number of squares. In this case, 8 squares fill up the area. So I can say 1 by 8 gives us 8 squares. I can also say that 1 times 8 is equal to 8. Okay, so that's how the area model works. Let's try it with a few others. Let's try it with the 2 times 8. So if I write 2 times 8, I'm also saying 2 by 8. Okay, what does that look like? Well, I should draw a picture again. I can start by making a 1 on one side and 2 on the other side. So the dimension here is 1, 2. So I have a two-sided, two measures here. On the other measure, though, I'll need to have 8. So 2 by 8. Let's count out our 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 across the top. 2 by 8. All right, so let's build our rectangle. Our rectangle will have a measure of 2 on this side. It'll have a measure of 8 on this side, measure of 2 on this side, and a measure of 8 on this side. We have a rectangle now. In the area model, we want to know how many squares there are, so let's mark them off. Notice that I'm making columns as I'm drawing these in. There should be 8 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now as I draw the rows, how many rows are there? There are 2 rows, right? So 2 rows by 8 columns. Well, we know we have 8 in this first row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now we've just added 8 more in the second row, right? Let's add them on. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So we have 16 altogether. So we can say that 2 by 8 is the same as 16 squares. We can also say that 2 times 8 equals 16. All right, so far so good. What about 3? Let's write out 3 times 8. We know that 3 times 8 is the same as saying 3 by 8. Okay, what does that look like? Let's draw it out. This measure has to have 3 units, right? 1, 2, 3. So we know we have a measure of 3 on this side. And on this side, we have to have 8. So let's measure it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 across the top. So what about our rectangle? Well, our rectangle should have a measure of 3 on this side, 8 across the bottom, 3 on this side, and 8 across the top. Okay, so we have a nice rectangle. But for the area model, we need to know how many squares there are. Let's find out. Let's make our columns first. How many columns will there be? There should be 8 columns, right? So count them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How many rows will there be? Well, let's count them out. 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows. So 3 rows by 8 columns. How many squares? Well, we know that this first row has a measure of 8 squares. The first 2 rows together make 16 squares. Now we have 1 more row to add on, so 16 and 8 more. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So we can say that 3 by 8 rectangle has 24 squares. 24 squares. Okay, what else does that tell us? It tells us that 3 times 8 equals 24. Okay. What about 4 by 8? Or 4 times 8? Let's write it out. 4 times 8 is the same thing as saying 4 by 8. Okay. Let's draw it out then. Let's see. I'll start here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's a measure of 4 here. And in the other dimension we have to have 8, right? So let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So across the top we have a measure of 8. What about our rectangle? Well, our rectangle should have a measure of 4 on this side, measure of 8 over here, a measure of 4 on this side, and a measure of 8 across the top. Okay, we need to know how many squares there are, so let's work that out. How many columns will we have? Okay, we should have 8 columns again, right? You can count them if you want. So 8 columns. How many rows? 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So we want to know in a 4 by 8 rectangle, 4 by 8, how many squares are there in area? Well, we know that the first row is going to give us 8. So the first row will always give us 8. The second row and the first row together give us 16. And the 3 rows together give us 24. Now we have to add on 8 more, right? So 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. 32 altogether. So a 4 by 8 rectangle gives us 32 squares. Now if we know this 4 by 8 rectangle gives us 32 squares, we also know that 4 times 8 equals 32. Okay, so far so good. What about 5 by 8 or 5 times 8? Let's work it out. 5 times 8 is the same thing as saying 5 by 8. So we need a rectangle that has dimensions of 5 on one side and 8 on the other. So let's build it. I'll start here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 on this side and 8 on the other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 across the top. Let's build our rectangle. This rectangle has a dimension of 5 on this side 8 across the bottom, 5 on this side, 8 across the top. Now we have a rectangle. How many squares are in it? Let's find out. Let's draw our columns first. 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, 5 columns, 6 columns, 7 columns, and 8 columns at the end. How many rows? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, but now how many squares? Well, we know our first row has 8 squares. Our first 2 rows together make 16. 3 rows together give us 24. 4 rows together take us to 32. And now a final row of 8. So 32 and 8 more. 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. 40 squares altogether. So we know that a 5 by 8 rectangle gives us 40 squares. It also tells us that 5 times 8 equals 40. Okay. What about 6 times 8? Let's draw it out. 6 times 8 is the same as 6 by 8. What does that look like? Let's draw it out. One dimension has to have 6, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 on this side. What about the other dimension? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 on that dimension. What about our rectangle? Well, our rectangle will have a side of 6, a base of 8, another side of 6, and a top of 8. Now we have a nice rectangle. How many squares are in here? Let's build our columns and our rows to find out. Each column, there are 8 columns, but every one of the columns has 6 squares in it, doesn't it? 8 columns has 6 squares in each, and the opposite in the other direction. How many squares does each row have? This row has 8 squares, so 6 rows of 8 squares. So I have 3 rows, 4 rows, 5 rows, 6 rows. Okay, but how many squares are there altogether? Well, this first row has 8. The first 2 rows make 16. The first 3 rows make 24. The first 4 rows make 32. The first 5 rows make 40. Now we have to add on that new row, right? 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48. 48 altogether. All right, what does that tell us? It tells us that a rectangle that's 6 by 8 units in measurement, 6 by 8, has 48 squares inside. 6 by 8 gives us 48 squares. What else does that tell us? It tells us that 6 times 8 equals 48. Okay, so far so good. Let's go on to 7's. 7 times 8 is the same thing as 7 by 8. Okay, let's draw that out for ourselves. Let's start here. 7 by 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so there's 7 over here. And across the top, you know how many have to go across the top. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 across the top. Okay, let's build a rectangle that's 7 by 8. This dimension has 7 units. Across the base, we're counting out 8. On this side, 7. Across the top, 8. Well, how many squares are inside? Let's draw our columns. We're going to have 8 columns altogether. 8 columns. And how many rows will we have? If we have 8 columns, we're going to have 7 rows. Okay, let's draw them across. 2 rows, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the bottom one's 7. Well, how many squares are there in our rectangle that's 7 by 8? We know our first row is 8. Our first 2 rows make 16. Our first 3 rows take us to 24. Our first 4 rows take us to 32. Our first 5 rows take us to 40. Our first 6 rows take us to 48. But we have one more row, so we should add that in. 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56. 56 altogether. So a rectangle that's 7 by 8 gives us 56 squares in area. So 7 by 8, 56 squares. And that tells us that 7 times 8 equals 56. Okay, that's good. What about the next one? 8 by 8. Okay, so 8 times 8 is the same as 8 by 8. Let's draw it out then. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this side has a measurement of 8. What about across the top? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They're the same. I have the feeling we're going to be making a special kind of rectangle now. So let's build that rectangle. This side has a measurement of 8. This side has a measurement of 8. This side has a measurement of 8. And this side has a measurement of 8. It's a square, isn't it? A special rectangle. So how many squares are inside here? Let's find out. Let's draw our columns in. 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, 5 columns, 6 columns, 7 columns, and 8 columns altogether. And rows? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the bottommost makes 8. So 8 rows and 8 columns, 8 by 8. Okay, how many squares? Well, we know the first one is going to be 8. The first 2 rows make 16. The first 3 rows give us 24. The first 4 rows give us 32. The first 5 rows take us to 40. The first 6 rows take us to 48. The first 7 rows take us to 56. And we need to add one more row now. 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64. 64 squares altogether. Alright, so we know that a rectangle that is 8 by 8 in measurement gives us 64 squares. 64 squares. What else does that tell us? It tells us that 8 times 8 equals 64. Okay, let's do one more. What about 9 times 8? That would be the same as saying 9 by 8. Okay, well, let's draw it out. Let's start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is going to have to be the most ever, huh? And across the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, let's build our rectangle. This rectangle has a measurement on one side of 9, on another side of 8, on this side of 9, and across the top also 8. 8 across the top. Okay, now we need to know how many squares are inside here. So let's figure this out again. Let's draw our columns. And hopefully you can draw them better than I can. You know you can always do this yourself on a piece of graph paper. 2 columns. 3 columns. 4 columns. 5 columns. 6 columns. 7 columns. And 8 columns at the end. And now the rows. How many rows? 1 row. 2 rows. 3 rows. 4 rows. 5 rows. 6 rows. 7 rows. 8 rows. And a 9th row. Okay? But now we need to know how many squares there are. This rectangle measures 9 by 8. A lot of squares in here. Let's use what we know. We know this first row has to have 8 squares. We know the first 2 rows together make 16. We know the first 3 together make 24. We know the first 4 rows take us to 32. We know the first 5 rows take us to 40. We know the first 6 rows take us to 48. We know the first 7 rows take us to 56. We know the first 8 rows take us to 64, but we have one more row, so let's add it on. 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. So now we know that a 9 by 8 rectangle, 9 on one side, 8 on another, when we count all the squares on the inside, gives us 72. So a 9 by 8 rectangle gives us 72 squares. And that also tells us that 9 times 8 equals 72. So this is the area model. In the area model, what you care about are dimensions. So if we look at here, 5 times 8, the dimensions of the rectangle have to be 5 by 8. 5 on one side, 8 on the other side. And what we care about in the area model are the numbers of squares that are made when you make a rectangle that's 5 by 8. In this case, 5 by 8 gives us 40 squares. That also tells us that 5 times 8 equals 40. I hope this has been helpful for you.